like Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who was the only woman in the Civil War to be commissioned a recruiting officer by the governor of a state. She was commissioned by Governor Oliver Morton of Indiana. She understood, these recruiting officers understood that they were recruiting freedom fighters who were going to enforce that proclamation and help save the Union. That's what they understood. Lincoln immediately in January of 1863 would begin sending letters to his generals telling them, you need to start bringing them in. You need to start bringing them in. He would write to the governor of Tennessee, the military governor of Tennessee had seceded from the Union. But Andrew Johnson, senator from Tennessee, remained in his seat, and when the Union took control of Tennessee in the summer of 1862, Johnson was named the military governor. Lincoln would write to Johnson in March of 1863 and say to Governor Johnson, I've heard that you fought, and he emphasizes fought about raising a force of Negro soldiers. Goes on to say, I think that's a good idea. And he tells him, quote, the mere sight of 50,000 armed and drilled black men on the Mississippi River will bring this contest to an end. Close quote. That's what Lincoln wrote. Lincoln is fully committed to raising colored troops. He sends Daniel Heumann, a lawyer from New York, commissions him a brigadier general, sends him to the upper Mississippi, or I'm going to say the upper Mississippi Delta, around Lake Providence, Louisiana, to organize a regiment. This would become a regiment, brigade actually known as the African Brigade. And on June 6, 1863, they would engage a Confederate force almost 3 times their size. The battle lasted 36 hours, mostly hand-to-hand combat, and the help of naval gunfire, they repulsed the larger Confederate force. Grant, some of his senior officers were there to witness the battle, and Grant would take note of these African descent soldiers. Indeed, Grant would capture Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863, with the help of African-American soldiers, sailors, guides, scouts, and spies. And Grant would write to President Lincoln, after Lincoln wrote to him. Lincoln wrote to Grant and says, I want you to make sure that we vigorously recruit colored troops. And Grant tells Lincoln, August 1863, well, even if I didn't agree with your policy on these colored troops, I would follow the order because I'm a good general. He said, but I do agree with it. And he tells President Lincoln, quote, by arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally, close quote. I want you to pay close attention to the general's language. He did not say by freeing the Negro. He says by arming. And Grant did not say we've simply added more bodies to our army. He said we've added what? A powerful ally. Different figures on the battlefield. In 1863, whether we're talking about battlefields in what was known as the Western Theater along the Mississippi River Valley, along the Texas coast, on battlefields in what was known as the Eastern Theater along the Atlantic coast, African-American soldiers not only demonstrated that they could and would fight, they demonstrated that they could and would fight well. Indeed, Lincoln, in his annual message to Congress in December of 1863, would say that my emancipation policy is working. And these colored troops, these Negro soldiers that we brought in, they're making as good as soldiers as any. And he cited as evidence that his emancipation policy was working the fact that the Mississippi River had been opened up and that the rebel territories had been split in two with little or no communication between the two parts. Now remember Salmon P. Chase when he said that Lincoln suggested that the only way that Mississippi was going to be opened up was with these African descent soldiers? That was Lincoln's policy, and it was successful. So he's boasting about it in his message to Congress in December of 1863. Also of note is the annual report of the Secretary of War to Congress, December 5th, 1863. Edwin Stanton wrote, quote, the slave has proved his manhood, close quote. I want you to take note of that. We have some today that like to talk about, African-American scholars like to talk about how the manhood was taken away from the slave. Yet the War Department who's witnessing him on the soldiers on the battlefield says the slave has proved his manhood. Stanton would go on to cite battles like Port Hudson, where Captain Andre Caillou led the assault, as evidence. And with that assault, that was very important as a part of the Vicksburg campaign. The whole objective behind Port Hudson was not simply to attack, to take the fort. It was to create such a presence at Port Hudson that the Confederate forces at Port Hudson could not go up to Vicksburg to reinforce the forces there. That was the strategic purpose. He cited Milliken's Bend. He cited Fort Wagner, where the 54th Massachusetts would lead the assault. Out of 600 men on the assault, they lost 30 killed in action, 24 mortally wounded. I know those numbers are shocking for those of you who saw the Glory, but they told you that the number was what? Over half. But it's 54 fatalities out of 600. Whoever believes that's over half, I want you to owe me some money. Also, just to point out the movie Glory, they say of that, they say the fort was never taken. Actually, the fort was taken on September 7th, 1863 by United States colored troops to include the 54th Massachusetts. So at the end of 1863, African-American soldiers had demonstrated that they were very good. And in that report, Stanton also said, well, we know that he cited those assaults as evidence that they made good infantry. Then he cited the fact that in the Navy, it had always been known that they made good cannoneers, good artillerymen. So of course they're going to make good artillerymen in the Army. Then he goes on to say, and we now know as evidence from the 1st Mississippi Cavalry of African descent down in Mississippi that they make good cavalrymen as well. He cited a report where the Company A of the 1st Mississippi Cavalry took on a larger Confederate force and defeated it. And I do want to point out that my great-great-grandfather, Edward Whitfield, was in Company A of the 1st Mississippi Cavalry of African descent. So at the end of 63, the Union knows that they've got a powerful ally in the African-American soldier. When General Grant takes command of the Army of the Army, becomes General in Chief of the Army, in March of 1864, he arrives here in Washington, spring of 1864, and there are no United States colored troop regiments in the Army of the Potomac. The jewel of the Union Army, that army responsible for the defense of Washington, the principal army attempts to capture Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. General Grant would immediately begin transferring United States colored troop regiments from other regions of the country. Grant wants his powerful allies on the battlefield in the most important campaign in the war, the campaign to capture Richmond, Virginia. And when Washington is threatened, in the summer of 1864, Grant would pull United States colored troop regiments into the defenses of Washington. He would even go to Camp William Penn in Pennsylvania and take troops who had not yet been assigned to their regiments and bring them down here. About a battalion-sized unit, about 300 soldiers would be brought down in the defenses of Washington in the summer of 1864. Grant wants his powerful allies in the most important campaigns in the war. Grant understands, and indeed, Grant would put them on the front lines in front of Richmond. Now, I've heard some scholars say the reason they put the African-American soldiers in first, the reason they put them on the front lines is because Grant was a racist. Now, he's putting them in first. This is their rationalization. They're leading scholars. You can read this on your own. These scholars are saying that Grant put them on the front line, sent them in first, so they could be cannon fodder, so they get killed. They were his worst soldiers, so he sent them in first. Now, I spent 21 years in the Marine Corps. From my perspective, that's an absolutely ridiculous statement. In the Marine Corps, we boast of going in first. Why? Because we're the best. In the Army, the 82nd Airborne goes in first. Why? Because they're the best. The 101st Airborne goes in first. Why? Because they're the best. I challenge you to find a single American military theorist, a single American general who has ever written, we send our worst in first. That's like finding a football or basketball coach who says, well, you know, I always send my worst players in first. No, she doesn't. She's trying to win the game. War is more important than football or basketball. The objective is not to go and die before the fortification. The objective is to break a hole in the fortification so you can exploit it and capture it. Grant was trying to capture Richmond. He was not trying to die in front of Richmond. And Grant would place his powerful allies, his African-American soldiers, on the front lines in front of Richmond. General Grant would write in his memoirs that on April 3rd, 1865, the 25th Army Corps, under General Godfrey Weitzel, captured Richmond, Virginia. Ladies and gentlemen, the 25th Army Corps is the only Army Corps in the history of the United States comprised of only African-American regiments. According to General Grant's order of battle, it is an indisputable historical fact that American soldiers of African descent captured and occupied the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. Challenge you to find a single American history textbook today. Challenge you to find a single Civil War bestseller. This story is one of the best kept secrets in American history to this day, but is well reported in official records. Grant's memoirs, 25th Army Corps captured Richmond. This is what Grant wrote. So just go to the order of battle, figure out who the 25th Army Corps is, and you got an answer to your question. It was well reported in newspapers. New York newspapers, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, but my favorite is the Daily National Republican out of Washington, D.C. Headlines on the evening of April 3rd, 1865 read, "Extra glorious fall of Richmond captured by the black troops." Pretty clear, captured Richmond. Well reported in the newspapers, April 1865. And that newspaper also says that Lee was retreating. If you read a lot about the Civil War, you'd be convinced that the Army of Northern Virginia was by far the best army in the Civil War. But Lee's army was retreating from Petersburg and Richmond in early April 1865. Lee was trying to take his army south and west to western North Carolina so that he might join his Army of Northern Virginia with the Confederate Army of Tennessee led by General Joseph E. Johnston, so that together they might continue to prosecute the war. But in the early morning of April 9th, 1865, a brigade of United States colored troops came up along the Lynchburg Road just south and west of a place called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. About 3,000 men, the United States colored troops in that brigade. They engaged Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in a skirmish. The fight lasted 5 hours, and at 8 a.m. in the morning, Lee discerned that he could no longer continue to prosecute the war. And later that day, he would surrender to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, because that is where he was stopped by a brigade of United States colored troops. Challenge you to find in a single American history textbook. Challenge you to find in a single Civil War bestseller. But you'll find it in the official records. There were 14 African-American regiments present at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, when Lee surrendered to Grant on April 9, 1865. This story is one of the best kept secrets in American history. In fact, the story is so suppressed today that we have some generals that scholars speak about that would make that general an idiot. Example, William Tecumseh Sherman. If you go and poll scholars, I guarantee that over 90% of them will tell you Sherman didn't use colored troops. If Sherman didn't use colored troops, Sherman was an idiot. Why? It's because Sherman was in the Vicksburg campaign. Sherman was a friend of Grant. Grant told him we've added a powerful ally. Do you really believe Sherman wouldn't use them? In Sherman's Atlanta campaign, Sherman says the great question is one of supplies. Guess who guarded his supply line? 13 African-American regiments. United States colored troops. Answering the great question, in the Marine Corps we call that prioritization. When you prioritize, as Captain Harry Jones, General, trust me, I'm going to send somebody I know can accomplish the mission. Sherman assigned United States colored troops to guard his supply line. Sherman sent United States colored troops in as his guides, spies, scouts. They were really more spies than scouts because he took their uniforms away from them. And I've heard scholars say, well, that's evidence that he didn't like them as soldiers. He took their uniforms away from them. The men he took the uniform away from, they were from northern Georgia, southern Tennessee, and northern Alabama. That's where his operations are being conducted. These are his spies. What was he supposed to do? Tell his enemy, John B. Hood, oh yeah, we got Negroes with our army. They're my spies. Instead, he tells Hood, no, we have not a single Negro with our army. Of course, that's what he's going to say if he's smart. I was trained to do things like that, deceive my enemy. Finally, Sherman, he would write in his memoirs, quote, I doubt whether the history of war can furnish more examples of skill and bravery than those that attended to the defense of the rail in the year 1864 from Nashville to Atlanta. Close quote. If we go to his order of battle, we know that William Tecumseh Sherman was talking about United States colored troops that defended his rail. If we go to the primary sources, we'll discover a story of African-American soldiers, sailors who fight with noteworthy courage. We find a story of a disenfranchised, enslaved population that answered a cry for help from the federal government, helped save the Union, and by enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, they freed themselves in their own fashions. One of the best kept secrets in American history is the story of these American freedom fighters. We must recognize how good they were, much like the Confederacy began to recognize how good they were as soldiers. And I send you to a letter written on September 26, 1864, by the governor of Louisiana, Henry Allen. Henry Allen writes the Secretary of the War of the Confederacy and says to him, the time has come for us to now start bringing able-bodied Negro men into our army. And he goes on to address this question on whether Negroes make good soldiers, and he tells him, quote, we have learned from dear-bought experience that Negroes can be taught to fight, close quote. What is he saying? We don't need a discussion on whether they can fight or not. We've learned from their performance on the battlefield that they can be taught to fight. African-American soldiers were outstanding in this. They were outstanding soldiers. And though we talk about the racial animosity that caused discrimination from the Union against them, they overcame that. And though we talk about the racism of the Confederate soldiers who would take no quarters, this would backfire on the Confederacy. And I end today with a quote from General John Alexander Logan, addressing this question of massacring colored troops. General Logan wrote, "The cry with which our correction. Stop it, I got excited." Quote, "The cry with which our Union black soldiers went into battle, remember Fort Pillow, inspired them to deeds of valor and struck with fear the hearts of the enemy. On many a bloody field, Fort Pillow was avenged." Close quote. The story of United States colored troops is the story of victors. It is not the story